Okay, our last speaker of this morning's session is Chris Jordan. Chris is a research fisheries biologist who thinks about how rewilding riverscapes will benefit humans, fish, beavers, and trees. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, so I want to talk about designing low-tech process-based restoration projects, that sort of concept, why you do them, how you do them, and I want to talk about speed bumps. And we've heard a bunch about speed bumps already this morning in terms of regulatory speed bumps. We often talk about the low-tech process-based restoration projects themselves as speed bumps to slow down water. So there are good speed bumps and there are bad speed bumps. I also heard that we're not supposed to think about things as good and bad, that's polarizing. So there are up and down speed bumps. I'll do my best. Okay, I think we can all agree that more than half of our streams are impaired in function, impaired in process, and it's really easy to identify them as impaired. They're ugly. They clearly aren't streams. The few places that are intact, where we have intact connected floodplains, again, are also easy to identify. We look at that and say, yeah, that's great, that's beautiful. There's not a lot of them, but you know it when you see it. So what are those components of a healthy riverscape? Well, there's three. Streams need space, and that's the floodplain. We call that the floodplain. That might be active or inactive floodplain, but that's the space. There might be a lot of it, there might be a little bit of it, depending on the confinement. But the streams need and they own that space. That's their space, not ours. That's their space. Healthy riverscapes need structure. That structure forces complexity. And healthy riverscapes need flow. Not the way we normally think of flow as lots of flowing water. They need inefficient flow. They need inefficient conveyance. And these needs, unfortunately, are connected to each other. They're inseparable. You can't have one without the other. And having all of those components and having them connected to each other is what makes a healthy riverscape. And it depends. So this is an unconfined floodplain. Here's a confined floodplain. So streams need access to all the space that they have available to them, and that varies. There's different kinds of structure. There's wood, there's beaver dams, there's vegetation, there's rocks, but that structure needs to be there, and that structure forces the engagement of that stream with that space. So that structure forces complexity. It forces lateral and vertical complexity. And that results in flow inefficiency. So all these components must be there, and they must be connected to each other. And that's the components of a healthy riverscape. Now you know the building blocks. So if you enter into restoration in a process-based way, that is, you're trying to restore the connections, those processes, those are the three things that you're looking for and you're trying to tackle. Space, structure, the things in the channel, and the resultant mixing of that structure in that space is flow inefficiency and a connected floodplain. So if your problem is confinement where there's space available, and the confinement in this case is a levee, you're not going to give that stream back to that space without removing the levee. If that stream, unfortunately, is entrenched, is incised, it can't access the floodplain, it can't access that space without some structure to push it up and out. Once it's pushed up and out, then it can access the space, it spreads out, it slows down, it becomes flow inefficient. So these things, there's an order to them, and there's a necessity that all the pieces are there. You can think about those three dimensions sort of as a three-dimensional shape of sort of the space axis, the flow axis, and the structure axis. And most streams, most impaired streams, are sitting over here away from the structure side, where they have space because it's there, whether they can access it or not, and there's flow unless someone's stolen the water. But without that structure, that flow inefficiency in occupying the space is not possible. So your restoration world, your restoration activity tends to be moving that stream from there into the sweet spot in the middle where they're all there. That structure, that hydraulic roughness, that's where the biology comes in here. So that structure, those structural elements are vegetation, it's wood, or grasses or sedges that are interrupting the channel, interrupting the flow. It's beaver dams, and so that's the components of the structure, that hydraulic roughness, that structural complexity in the middle. So here now we have this balance and I mentioned this yesterday, you have this balance between physics and biology. That biology is providing that structure, and the physics is the inevitability of water running downhill, and you want to get that water to run laterally before it goes downhill, and the only way to do that is to put something in its way. Okay, you're now experts in low-tech process-based restoration. Nice. Let's spend the rest of this talk building projects. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to run you through 3 scenarios, and we're going to look at them in this context of the expertise that you've just acquired. And your design objectives are connected floodplain. Because when you have a connected floodplain, you have a functioning riverscape. It's a good diagnostic. It's a hard thing to measure, but if you've achieved it, you're done. And because you're going to get all those associated benefits that we've heard that come from a beaver-modified floodplain, they come from all connected floodplains. Okay, your tools in your toolbox are beaver dam analogs, otherwise known as BDAs. These are human-constructed abandoned beaver dams. That is, they look like a beaver dam, but they don't come with a maintenance contract. So it's functionally an abandoned beaver dam. It lasts as long as an abandoned beaver dam does, and that's okay. That's a good thing. Post-assisted log structures, otherwise known as PALs. These are human-constructed mobile wood. This is not a fixed permanent thing. This is mobile wood. You're feeding the system some roughness elements that you don't care if they move around. That's why you have to put a lot of it in there, but that's one of your tools. And the third is beaver, otherwise known as beavers. And we already know what they do. So those are the 3 tools. Okay, so we're going to build some projects. Here's our design objectives. Here's your tools. We just need to ask for permission. And the last couple of talks have kind of been a bummer about how hard it is to ask for permission. Well, I'm going to add to that. I'm sorry. All right. So what's standing in the way? So one of the objectives of this meeting, why Scott and Mike invited us here, was let's have a nationwide conversation about beaver-connected floodplains. Well, if we're going to have a nationwide conversation about beaver-connected floodplains, then we need to talk about what's the national regulatory framework for allowing that. It sounds bad to be one province in Canada, but what we're just going to do is one nation, right? So what's standing in our way from doing that? Are there laws? Are there roadblocks or speed bumps? Or is it cash? Well, Brian told us it's not cash. There's buckets out there, right? Pallets. So Build Back Beaver has been funded. But we can't do it. It takes years or costs most of our cash in order to do that. So what I want to do is look at some of the things on a national level that we are going to have to think about if we really want to accomplish this national conversation, which I think we should, this national conversation about nature-based solutions, beaver-based solutions for connected floodplains, for climate change, for water security, for whatever gets you down the road. The same thing needs to happen first, which is connected floodplains. But before that, you have to get permission to connect the floodplain. All right, there are lots of things that are standing in the way. I wanted to throw out 3 of them: Clean Water Act, National Flood Insurance Act, and the North American Model of Wildlife Management. These are all well-meaning. They are cultural constructs, or they are laws. They are there for good reasons, in the right time and place and context. Unfortunately, they're a bit dated and in drastic need of revision if we're really going to accomplish this. And why? Well, because of nature-based solutions. These are not these 3 things that I'll talk about are not in the context of a nature-based view of the world. And they are not necessarily amenable for continent-scale actions. And that means rapidity and low cost of implementation. Okay, so let's do this. All right, let's start with the Clean Water Act. Clean Water Act is under the purview of the Environmental Protection Agency, comes from a suite of environmental regulations that were put in by the Nixon administration in the 70s. Good deal. It resulted in an enormous cleanup and a change in our consciousness as a nation about pollution. Nothing but good things to say about the Clean Water Act, till it gets in my way. So it has jurisdiction over all waters of the U.S. With identified beneficial uses. And unfortunately, those identified beneficial uses don't include beaver. That might be one crack to stick a pry bar in. The impairments are identified. There's a list of the potential impairments. Those are identified, and each river system is evaluated for its total maximum daily load that it can tolerate. And if that river system, if that watershed is over that then you have to have a mitigation plan. In general, the Clean Water Act focuses on point source pollution, not non-point source pollution. And that's because it's a regulatory piece of statute, and it's really easy to go to one outflow pipe and regulate that source. It's harder to go to an entire national forest and say, you're making the water warm or maybe a little too silty. So point source versus non-point source solution is a little bit of an issue. And from the great ad campaign of the EPA from the start of the Clean Water Act is dilution is the solution to pollution. It's not really a solution, it's just sending it to your neighbors. But it works, sort of. But the main mechanism we'll talk about here is crediting. That is, if there is a problem, how do you actually mitigate it, and who gets credits for mitigating it for somebody else? Because now you have a marketplace for those credits, and you have a regulatory context, something that you can quantify. Okay, so crediting. Here's our first work site. This is in Western Massachusetts. What do you think? If you were asked, if you were doing a site visit, Jacob earlier said that your first job is to do a site assessment. Would you say, yeah, there's work to be done here? Or they'd say, I feel bad taking your money. Who would take the money? Well, that's a bad question. Who would do work here because they think there's something to be done? Who would not do work here because they think it looks really good? Man, you guys need work. I thought you were an expert in process-based restoration. Where's the space? Is there space? Does this stream have space? Yeah, there's some space. Yeah, it's got, it's a little entrenched, but it's not in a canyon. Does it have flow inefficiency? Is anything holding this water back from moving downhill? No. Is anything pushing this water laterally? So where's the structure? Where's the complexity? This is not a connected floodplain system. There are missing elements in this system. You can see that. There's some clues. What do I see when I look at this? I see boulders. I see rocks that are way bigger than they're competent to be moved by this system, which means every smaller bit has been moved away because this is an efficient conveyance system. It has sucked every bit of substrate that should stay here out. I see a straight channel. I don't see any side channels. I don't see any branching. I also see an awful lot of trees, which means this stream hasn't moved at all for a long time. So I think there's a lot of work to be done here. I think there's complexity to be added. I think there's floodplain connection to be added. And floodplain connection can be vertical, not just lateral too. So there's a lack of vertical connectivity that is between surface water and groundwater. That's absent here. So I think this is a job for steel or Husqvarna. This is a chainsaw job. I would start by cutting down a lot of trees. Who disagrees with me? The state might, because there's a TMDL for temperature on this stream. And how is that TMDL satisfied? Shade, right? So we have caused a problem in watersheds. We've mismanaged the land and the water, and we've warmed up the water to the point where we say the water's too warm. We have imposed a solution to that problem. One solution to that problem. Shade, which drives us to leave trees and plant trees where they weren't meant to be, where they are no longer helpful, where they are holding the system in place, where they are keeping the sunlight out of the system and removing the primary productivity, that's removing the base of the food chain from this system. But they are the answer to a problem. They are the only answer that we've been given to that problem. We have a temperature problem. The only answer is shade. Unfortunate. So, what do we do about that? Well, we start to push on the science that says shade is not the only answer to temperature problems. Here is the Oregon high desert, not known for trees. Here is a system, the same system, where hydraulic roughness is providing cooling, is providing temperature mitigation. There's no pathway for using this tool to mitigate for temperature for TMDLs under the Clean Water Act. So here's a riffle in this stream. A bunch of the red dots are temperature loggers. Here's the temperature trace for the hot time of the year in July. All of these temperature loggers have the same diurnal fluctuation in temperature. And this is hot. This is warm water, 25, 26 degrees C. Here is a reach with one functioning and 2 abandoned beaver dams, and many more temperature loggers, and also in a hot part of the summer. And you see many of those temperature loggers are showing sort of the same free stream, simple water temperature profile, but lots of those temperature loggers are also showing not that, and even one temperature logger that's in the free stream, so up in the channel, is showing groundwater temperature, constant 11 degrees. This is engagement, this is vertical connectivity of this surface water with the hyperbaric zone, with the groundwater. And this is providing temperature mitigation, and this happens at scale. And this then not only allows all the other ecological functions that you get out of a connected floodplain that everyone has been talking we have to get, and you're getting mitigation of temperature impairments, but we can't use these credits because we don't have a way to quantify it and apply it. So that otherwise, you could put in beaver dams to get thermal credits as opposed to planting trees. Wouldn't that be cool? Now you're using the power. You don't have to change the Clean Water Act. You have to change the implementation plan to allow the Clean Water Act to be used by everybody. Incentivize beaver dams, don't incentivize shade. Okay, National Flood Insurance Act. This is an important piece of protection for property owners and for the insurance industry to allow property development, unfortunately, in the floodplain. It's kind of too late, that's there. And until we as a society decide that we shouldn't be developing the floodplain, underwriting the insurance companies, which allow us to actually have some certainty of protection of our property in that area, we've decided is important. And the way that is implemented is mapping a 100-year floodway, and then regulating what happens inside that floodway in terms of insurance and development to not make the situation any worse. And the way you don't make it any worse is achieving the no-rise condition. That is, when there's any development, and my question is any restoration, in that 100-year floodway, what do you do? So here's the development model of the regulatory framework. Here's a cross-section of a very sad channel. The channel is this ditch in the middle. Here's the mapped floodway. Here is the first talk from this morning. Here's the boundary where we've said water can be inboard from here, and water is not allowed outboard of there. Otherwise, somebody's upset someplace. But we've decided that we're giving that much to the stream. That's the 100-year floodway. And so if we do something in the floodplain or adjacent to the floodplain, so the gray stuff is some development that's been proposed, by doing that, if that changes where the water goes, and this is through hydraulic and hydrologic modeling, if that floodplain elevation changes at all or by 1 foot, that's the definition of no rise, between 0 and 1 foot, then you have a problem. You can't do it unless you remap the floodway and everyone agrees to it, period. And that's a very expensive and a very long-term process, especially if you're trying to get a redefinition of the floodplain of the 100-year floodway. And this is, in a sense, puts a stop on restoration in areas with 100-year that are designated as floodways. And counties are the units that decide to designate areas as floodways. In some cases, they do a good job of choosing where on a river network the floodway could exist or it can't exist. In other cases, they're lazy and they just say every waterway in the county has a 100-year floodway, which means anywhere, even in remote parts of the county, you can't do work without satisfying the FEMA no-rise condition. So here's that same profile of a stream, and we've done process-based restoration. We've connected the floodplain, and we've got now a nice connected floodplain with a multi-threaded channel on the surface. It's happy with vegetation, but where is this line, and are we allowed to do that? This is a nature-based solution to the impaired system here, and we're running into a regulatory framework which is to protect infrastructure and private property infrastructure. EPA or FEMA Region 10, which is Washington, I think it's Washington, Oregon, maybe Idaho or California, I can't remember where the map goes. They granted themselves permission to do salmon habitat projects that most likely didn't affect the flood elevation, and granted themselves and everyone who was doing those projects in that footprint an exemption to this statute, which was fantastic. Projects went on the ground like crazy. Then someone pointed out that that office didn't have the authority to grant themselves exemption to a federal law, which is probably true. But they had been okay with it, and all of us implementers had been okay with it for a while, and then they had to issue a memo taking it back, which means now every project to go through that has to ask this question: are they in a no-rise or a rise condition? And that adds an enormous financial burden to a project in order to ask and answer that question. Here's our project. First question: would you do something here? Do you see a problem? What are the problems that you see? Is there space? This stream is not entrenched, right? There's not a great picture to show you space, but I'll assert that there's space here. Is there structure? No structure. So inefficiency in flow is non-existent. So there's some work to do here. But this is in a mapped floodway. So now to do the work to connect the floodplain, you are going to have to do an H&H analysis. You're going to have to convince the county that this new floodway is not going to damage. There's a county road nearby. There's no housing, so there's not a lot of negotiation with landowners. However, there is a negotiation with the county, and that's a year-long process in order to engage in. Okay, the last thing I want to touch on, I know I'm running out of time, is the North American model of wildlife conservation or management. It's not a law, it's a cultural construct, which actually means it's held more closely than a law, because laws are imposed by the government and we don't want to listen to the government. But this is us all doing a good job to protect wildlife. And I'll skip over the pieces of it. It comes from a good reason. It comes from the 1800s where we were not using wildlife resources, in engaging with wildlife resources in a sustainable, healthy, or anything positive way. These are bison skulls from contract hunters engaging in hide and meat generation, and also basically trying to wipe out cultures. And so the protections of wildlife are put in, but now in our context, this North American model has no room for wildlife having self-determination, coexistence with humans. Wildlife is really just a commodity, though it's a publicly held commodity. And it's really just, it's language that it exemplifies our colonialization of the natural world. So here's our last project site. Would you do something here? Jacob would. What about anybody else? This is what is held up by the state of Idaho as the most pristine salmon stronghold in the state. I think it's horrifying. I think it's the worst of all the examples, because it is in a remote area where there's no land use practices, there's only the historic degradation and the lack of the ability of the system to fix itself. And I would fix it by putting beaver back in here. But I'm putting beaver on the landscape where now beaver are going to be hunted and trapped and potentially removed, and remove the engine which could make this actually the fish factory that people think it is. So my last slide is the power of tiny actions. 3 little beaver dams here, taking what was, you can see what this meandering course of the stream was, and turning it into a connected, dynamic, laterally and vertically extensive connective floodplain. And that's what we want. This is how easy it is to get there, putting speed bumps in there. But the speed bumps that we've put in our own way are the big problem. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for a couple questions. Anyone with a question? Great.
Hi, Tony Sturm. So is your view of this normally accepted by hydrologists?
Yeah, absolutely. This is process-based restoration is a form of engaging in naturalizing conditions of streams. And clearly, in a built environment, asking a stream to re-engage with the floodplain is not always possible to the full extent of the historic floodplain. And so there has to be a conversation with that site about the degree to which that, taking a single-threaded channel and making it into a connected floodplain is possible. But in areas where the floodplain can be fully devoted to the river, then absolutely our simplified systems need to be recomplexified. But not every place can you do that, and that's restoring what everyone acknowledges, whether you're a practitioner or academic hydrologist, fluvial geomorphologist, aquatic biologist, is what these systems should look like. How we get back there, how we keep them there, and how we do that in the built environment, I think is where a lot of the controversy comes from.
So most hydrologists don't think of process-based restoration?
Well, it's a new way of thinking about how do we put the pieces together, and what do you do when you're confronted with the problem of an impaired stream? Do you build the structure that you think is missing? Because there the issue is you're going to be the maintenance contractor, right? Or do you build the process by which the system is self-sustaining? Because we know that's what the natural state was. These were resilient, naturally self-sustaining systems, and when you perturb them, they run to resilient, self-sustaining, impaired systems. So you have sort of an energy well, and how do you push it back to this new place? You've got to push it all the way so it can be in that new place. You get it halfway there, and it falls apart. You put it in a structure. That's why we have things like engineered log jams, because I want log structures, but I'm going to have to cable them to keep them there, because I don't have all the other processes that will naturally keep them or actually let them move, and something else will rack up there because that is a depositional point in the system. So that's allowing the system to be resilient. There was a talk this morning that talked about the resilience. So resilience is you perturb something and it comes back. That's how nature works. Human-built systems are resilient from being rigid, from having strength. We want that to be there. You push on it and it doesn't move. And we've defined that as resilience. That's not resilience, that's strong. Resilience is that storing of energy and returning the energy. And that's what a natural system does. And that's where our conflict is too, in terms of how we approach these, even philosophically. Do I see a missing set of pools, and so I'm going to dig some pools? Or do I make a system that's going to force and scour pools itself? One has a maintenance contract, the other doesn't. Great question.
So, Chris, timely talk, at least in between my 2 ears, because I've been thinking about this, and I've been doing some research on some of our local Maryland regulations, and I'm pretty sure that we have a non-tidal wetlands act that you have to apply for authorization if you're going to reduce the water surface of any stream or drain land. It's a protected resource. So flipping that, your talk upside down are there ways that we can use our existing regulations to say, well, actually, you take the beaver out, you're going to be in violation of this law or that regulation. Kind of the opposite of kind of what we're the obstacle.
Yeah, I absolutely, Scott. I think there should be that way. A sort of a slight perversion of that is suits, legal actions that were taken in Washington, Oregon, and now going on in California against USDA APHIS for trapping lethal remove of pesky beaver, because if we've decided that beaver make fish habitat, these are endangered fish, and they have protected populations and they have protected critical habitat. And if you remove the beaver that's degrading the fish habitat, you're in a sense unauthorized take. And you need an ESA permit to trap a beaver. What a cool idea. So far, it hasn't resulted in a jeopardy decision which say, no, you can't do that. But that's the idea, that what is the consequence of disrupting, in this case, an ecosystem engineer that's making something. We're looking for a market. We want a market for the water, a market for the carbon. Then the free market will solve the problem. Maybe. In this case, it's trying a legal construct. You're saying you're losing the water. That's protected water. You shouldn't be doing it. I think all of these things should be on the table, because in some point we're going to change someone's mind, or we're going to get. It involves lawyers, so it'd be expensive. But if we win in the end to change the hearts, then we won't need the lawyers.
Thank you so much.